At exactly 2:13 a.m., the line rang. I've been a 911 dispatcher for 11 years. I know what death sounds like. But the woman screaming on the other end of the line wasn't just dying. She was being hunted. She cried so hard her words tore apart. But one sentence came through with terrifying, crystal clarity. Please hurry. The killer is coming back for the children next. I dispatched emergency units instantly. Police arrived at the property within 4 minutes. The building was dead silent. No intruder. No forced entry. The family was fast asleep. But exactly 24 hours later, at 2:13 a.m., the house became a slaughterhouse. And every single word from that call started happening in real time, including the part where I heard my own voice on the recording, screaming for help inside the house. Before I had ever left my desk, rain slammed against the reinforced glass of the Seattle Emergency Dispatch Center. Outside, a massive Pacific Northwest storm was ripping through the electrical grid. Inside, I sat alone, staring at a wall of glowing blue monitors. 2:13 a.m. We call it the dead hour. It's the hour when drunk drivers wrap their cars around highway pillars, when overdoses happen silently behind locked bathroom doors, when the lonely and the desperate call 911 just to hear another human being breathe before they take their final step off a ledge. Tonight, the air in the room felt heavy, thick, like the atmospheric pressure had dropped straight through the concrete floor. 3 cups of cold, bitter coffee sat rotting next to my keyboard. I hadn't slept in 3 weeks. Ever since the divorce papers were finalized, my empty apartment felt less like a home and more like a tomb. My headset chimed. A new line opened. 911. What is the address of your emergency? Silence. Not a clean, digital cell phone silence. It was a dense, heavy layer of white noise. It sounded like old, magnetic tape dragging across an uncleaned machine. Then she screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was a raw, visceral sound pulled violently from deep inside her lungs. The sound of absolute, agonizing terror. I snapped upright in my chair. Ma'am, I need you to breathe. What is your location? The woman was hyperventilating, her gasps wet and frantic. I can't get out. Oh God, the back door is open. He's back inside the house. Behind her voice, my ears began mapping the background noise. I heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of footsteps walking on hardwood floors. Slow footsteps. Deliberate. The sound of someone who wasn't in a hurry because they knew their prey had nowhere left to run. And then fainter, deeper in the house. A child crying. Then she whispered it. The line that will haunt me until the day I die. Please hurry. The killer reaches the children's room first. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Ma'am, I am routing emergency services right now, but I need the address. Where are you? Cedar Heights Apartments. Building C. She sobbed, the audio breaking into heavy static. Please. He has a knife. I hit the priority dispatch key, sending a red alert notification to the police units. I have units en route, ma'am. What apartment number? I need an apartment number. The line didn't just drop. The audio began to stretch. The signal slowed down, the woman's crying dropping into a deep, guttural metallic groan. Right before the signal dissolved into pure white noise, she whispered something else. It was quiet, deliberate, and perfectly clear. You shouldn't answer tomorrow. The line went dead. I sat frozen. I stared at the active call log on my central monitor. Source number, restricted. Location ping, corrupted. It didn't feel like a prank call. It felt like a ghost rattling inside a piece of old copper wire. 7 minutes later, the radio console on my desk chirped. It was Officer Lena Ortiz, Unit 14. She was sharp, skeptical, and rarely rattled by the night shift. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. Arrived at the scene. I grabbed my headset microphone instantly. Go ahead, 14. What's your status? Do you see any signs of forced entry? There was a long, heavy pause on the radio. I could hear the rhythmic thumping of windshield wipers on her cruiser. When Ortiz spoke again, her voice held no urgency, only profound confusion. "Dispatch, there's nothing happening here." I frowned. "Unit 14, confirm your location." The caller was highly distressed. She stated an active intruder was inside the residence with a weapon. "I am looking directly at Cedar Heights Building C, Daniel," Ortiz replied, her tone completely flat. "There's no noise. The parking lot is dead quiet. The lights are out, and the residents appear to be completely asleep. The building is entirely normal." I checked the automated call routing data again. My heart began to thud uncomfortably against my ribs. "Are you absolutely certain you're at Building C? Check the rear entrance." "I'm standing in the main hallway right now," Ortiz said, her boots squeaking loudly against the dry linoleum over the radio feed. "It's completely clear. No signs of a struggle, no emergency whatsoever." She let out a short, annoyed sigh. "Dispatch, is somebody over there pranking us? Because it's a hell of a night to send us out on a wild goose chase." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I knew what I had heard. No actor alive could fake the raw, oxygen-starved panic in that woman's voice. "Unit 14, I said, my voice dropping into a low, deadly serious register. "Did you check the upper floors? Apartment numbers? Everything is locked down tight for the night, Daniel. There's nothing here." Then Lena's voice cracked through the headset again. Her tone shifted. "Wait." I gripped the edge of my desk until my knuckles turned white. "What do you have, Lena?" "I'm looking at the resident log by the mailboxes. I just ran a quick sweep of the second floor because I thought I saw a shadow move near the stairwell. I knocked on a couple of doors. A woman in apartment 9 opened her door. She looked terrified. She told me she heard screaming through her walls around 15 minutes ago. She thought someone was being murdered." My blood turned to ice. "What was the name of the tenant in apartment 9, Lena?" I heard the faint sound of paper rustling as Ortiz checked her terminal notes. "Tenant name listed on the unit door is Evelyn Harper." A wave of intense nausea hit me, so hard I had to close my eyes. I recognized that name instantly. Evelyn Harper had died exactly 2 years ago, at 3 a.m. I sneaked away from my desk and locked myself inside the dimly lit dispatch archive room in the basement. The room was a cold, windowless concrete box filled with rows of server racks and dusty shelves holding ancient backup drives. The air smelled of ozone and static electricity. I sat before a legacy terminal, pulled up the raw audio file from the 2:13 a.m. call, and pressed play. The woman's agonizing scream burst through my headphones. But this time, I didn't look at the data fields. I isolated the audio channels, filtering out the primary vocal track to analyze the background noise. As I boosted the lower frequencies, I noticed a jarring detail. The audio landscape was completely wrong. The background noise didn't match the modern telecommunications network. It had the distinct hiss of analog equipment. Then, hidden beneath the sound of the struggle, I picked up another sound. It was a television, very faint. A news reporter was speaking, their voice compressed and tinny. I pulled up the digital equalizer, cutting out the crackle of the static to amplify the specific frequency of the television broadcast. I pressed the headphones tight against my ears, repeating our top story. "Tomorrow, severe storm warning remains in effect across the greater Seattle area, with widespread power outages expected to persist into the late evening hours." I stopped breathing. The reporter wasn't talking about tonight's weather. Tonight's storm was a minor squall. The reporter on the recording was explicitly describing a historic weather system scheduled to hit the city tomorrow night. I replayed it 3 times. The result never changed. The emergency call wasn't an old tape. It wasn't a hoax. The recording wasn't from tonight. It was from tomorrow. Then, my hand began to shake as the recording continued past the 2-minute mark. I heard the heavy, thudding sound of boots kicking open a door. Heavy footsteps moving rapidly through an apartment hallway. And then a man's voice, hoarse, desperate, choked with panic, shouted through the audio feed. "This way. Move. Get to the stairwell." The headphones slipped from my hands. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The voice shouting inside the crime scene didn't belong to a responding police officer. It belonged to me. At sunrise, my shift finally ended. Instead of driving back to my apartment to sleep, I drove straight to the Cedar Heights complex. The apartment buildings stood quietly beneath a heavy blanket of low-hanging morning clouds. Everything looked completely, infuriatingly normal. A man in a yellow raincoat was walking a dog. 2 young children stood by the curb, laughing as they waited for their school bus. I entered Building C slowly. The lobby smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old carpets. I climbed the stairs to the second floor. Apartment 9 sat right near the very end of the hall, tucked into a dim corner where the fluorescent overhead light flickered with a rhythmic, irritating buzz. The door looked neglected. A thick layer of gray dust had collected along the top of the wooden frame, and the brass number 9 hung slightly crooked. I stepped forward and knocked carefully. No answer, only the hollow sound of wood echoing through an empty room. I pulled out my phone, logging into the secure dispatch database using my supervisor credentials. I pulled up the historical records for Cedar Heights, Unit 9. Status officially vacant. Prior tenant, Evelyn Harper. Status deceased. Cause of death, homicide by an unidentified intruder. Date of incident, exactly 2 years ago today. I stared at the date on my screen. 2 years ago today. Then, as I lowered my phone, something caught my eye near the door's brass deadbolt. Fresh, deep scratches surrounded the keyhole. The metal was bright and shiny, the paint scraped away in jagged lines, as if someone had recently, violently tried to force a key into the lock. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and pushed gently against the wooden panel. The door clicked. It wasn't locked. It swung open slowly, whining on ungreased hinges. The apartment smelled wrong immediately. It didn't smell like an empty, abandoned room. It didn't smell like dust or decay. It smelled like fresh blood and copper. The interior of the apartment was pitch black, the heavy blinds drawn tight. Every piece of furniture, a sofa, a dining table, a small television stand, was covered in thick, white plastic sheets, making them look like a collection of jagged, frozen ghosts in the dim light. I walked further into the room, my boots pressing into the stiff carpet. I moved toward the kitchen counter. There, sitting on a laminate countertop, was an old, analog digital tape answering machine. It looked like an artifact from the past, out of place and completely dead. Except it wasn't dead. A small, circular red light on the display was blinking. One unheard message. My heartbeat accelerated, a loud, rhythmic thudding in my ears. My hand hovered over the machine. Every logical instinct told me to turn around, walk out of the building, and go to a hospital. This was a hallucination. It had to be. I pressed the play button. The machine whirred, a mechanical clicking sound echoing through the vacant apartment. Then a massive wave of static filled the room, loud and violent. Through the white noise, a woman's voice whispered. It was the exact same woman from the 2:13 a.m. call, but her voice wasn't frantic now. It was hollow, exhausted, and terrifyingly cold. If you're hearing this, it means the shadow already found us. It means you didn't listen. I slowly stepped backward, my heel catching on the edge of a plastic-covered chair. The answering machine gave a long, digital beep, and the small LCD screen flickered, displaying the automated timestamp of the incoming message. Tomorrow, 2:16 a.m. By evening, the promised historic storm had officially arrived, slamming into the Seattle coast with unprecedented fury. The wind howled through the downtown high-rises, and the rain fell in sheets so thick it blinded the city's traffic cameras. Inside the emergency dispatch center, the atmosphere was chaotic. Emergency calls flooded the digital lines non-stop. Trees were falling onto power lines, basements were flooding, Local transformers were blowing out across the grid like a series of small electric firecrackers. I sat at my station, but I wasn't really there. I couldn't focus on the coordinates on my screen. I couldn't process the voices of the callers. Everything from the recording kept replaying inside my head in a continuous, agonizing loop. The woman's scream, the heavy footsteps, my own voice shouting through the darkness. I looked at the digital clock on my master console. 11:47 p.m. Suddenly, a loud pop echoed from somewhere outside the building, and the overhead fluorescent lights in the dispatch center flickered violently before the emergency backup generators kicked in with a low, vibrating hum. My terminal screen refreshed. A system status alert popped up on my secondary monitor. Transformer explosion, Sector 4. 3 blocks from Cedar Heights. The power outage had begun. It was unfolding exactly like the weather report from the future recording. My hand became ice cold. I could feel the sweat dripping down the back of my neck. I was watching a script play out, and I was trapped inside the theater. 1 hour later, the inevitable happened. A high-priority ticket flashed bright red on my screen. Incident type, home invasion in progress. Location, Cedar Heights Apartments, Building C. Reported, intruder sighted on the second-floor fire escape. I immediately stood up from my chair, knocking my cold coffee cup to the floor. The plastic cup shattered, splashing dark liquid across the tile. But I didn't care. No, I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. No, no, no. This is impossible. His hands flew across the console, automatically dispatching the maximum police response units to the address, my muscle memory taking over while my mind spiraled into absolute terror. Adrenaline flooded my system, making my vision tunnel. Then, the personal cell phone in my pocket began to vibrate. I pulled it out. The screen didn't show a contact name. It didn't show a number. It simply read unknown origin. I walked away from my terminal, stepping back into the shadow of the archive hallway, and answered the phone with a trembling hand. I pressed it to my ear. Hello. Pure, unadulterated static cascaded through the speaker. Then, the terrified woman's voice cut through the noise, screaming over the sound of breaking glass. You still have time. Get them out. You still have time. Who are you? I shouted into the phone, my voice cracking with desperation. How are you doing this? Why are you calling me? You answer tomorrow, she screamed, her voice tearing apart as the signal began to crackle violently. The loop is closing, Daniel. You answer tomorrow. The static roared louder, a deafening screech that made me pull the phone away from my ear. But before the line disconnected entirely, the woman's voice shifted from panic to absolute horror. She wasn't just screaming from fear anymore. She was screaming to warn me. Don't come here. Daniel, don't come in. The line went dead. A split second later, a deep, bass-heavy rumble shook the entire city block. Even inside the reinforced walls of the dispatch center, I felt the floor vibrate. Through the panoramic glass windows of the center, I watched as the power grid across Sector 4 failed completely, plunging the northern horizon into total darkness. Daniel didn't think. He didn't log out. He grabbed his heavy leather jacket from the back of his chair and ran for the emergency exit. The scene at Cedar Heights was absolute, apocalyptic chaos. The massive storm had knocked out all streetlights, leaving the apartment complex illuminated only by the frantic, flashing blue and red emergency lights of the arriving police cruisers. Rain fell in blinding sheets, mixing with the mud in the courtyard. I pushed through the police barricades, ignoring the shouts of the officers, trying to hold the perimeter. I ran toward the dark structure, my boots splashing through deep puddles. Then, high above the din of the sirens and the roaring wind, he heard it, a woman screaming from the second floor. The sound was coming from the end window of the hallway. Apartment 9. It was the exact frequency, the exact pitch, the exact live realization of the recording I had played 100 times in the dark basement of the archive room. Without a single thought for my own safety, I pulled my jacket collar over my mouth, and ran past a startled officer, throwing my body through the heavy doors of the lobby. The interior of the building was pitch black, silent except for the sound of my own heavy breathing and the rain drumming against the roof. The hallway looked exactly like the soundscape from the future call. The doors were shut, the shadows long and menacing, and from somewhere deeper inside the structure, I heard the muffled, terrified crying of small children. I stopped cold in the middle of the dark hallway, because right behind me, from my own throat, I heard myself shout the exact words to a terrified resident looking through a peephole. This way. Move. Get to the stairwell. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, more terrifying than any weapon. I wasn't listening to a warning about the future anymore. I wasn't a passive observer trying to avert a tragedy. The call hadn't been a prediction. It was a recording of this exact moment. I wasn't stopping the crime. I was creating it. My intervention was the very thing that made the recording exist. I kicked open the door of apartment 9. The interior was in ruins. Furniture was overturned, and the white plastic sheets covering the chairs were ripped to shreds. Through the dense gloom, I saw her, a young woman, her face pale with terror, trapped against the far window by a tall, shadowed figure holding a glinting blade. In her arms, she held a small, shivering child, protecting them with her own body. She looked exactly like the old photographs of Evelyn Harper, except she was alive. She was here. I plunged through the darkness, tackling the shadowed figure to the ground before the blade could descend. We crashed into the drywall, fighting frantically in the dark. I managed to twist the weapon out of the attacker's hand, throwing it across the floor. The figure scrambled backward into the shadows of the hallway, disappearing into the blackness of the building. I turned back to the woman, my chest heaving, my hands covered in scrapes. "I've got you. We have to go right now." The woman didn't run immediately. Instead, she turned her head and looked directly into my eyes. Her gaze wasn't filled with relief. It was filled with a deep, tragic pity. She leaned in close to my ear, her breath cold against my skin, and whispered through the darkness, "I told you not to answer." 3 days later, the storm had passed, leaving Seattle cold, washed out, and quiet. The official police reports were released to the press, stating that an unknown, transient intruder had attempted a home invasion at the Cedar Heights complex, but was deterred by an off-duty employee. The suspect remained at large, but when I pulled up the official city database from my home computer, I found something that chilled me to the bone. According to the revised architectural and city tax records, Building C of the Cedar Heights complex had only ever contained 8 units. Apartment 9 officially never existed. There was no record of an Evelyn Harper ever living there, let alone dying there 2 years ago. The system had wiped itself clean, resetting the anomaly as if it were a bad line of code in a computer program. I sat alone inside the dark dispatch archives room. It was 2:13 a.m. I was off duty, but I had used my master key to sneak back into the building. My hands were heavily bandaged from the struggle. I pressed the play button on the legacy terminal, replaying the original, unedited emergency call file one more time. I listened to the woman scream. I listened to the heavy footsteps. I listened to my own voice shouting through the darkness. But this time, I let the recording play past the point where it usually dissolved into white noise. I boosted the audio gain to its absolute maximum limit, filtering out the heavy digital hiss that marked the end of the file. Suddenly, I heard something new. It was tucked away in the final 3 seconds of the recording, hidden deep beneath the static, so faint it sounded like a ghost breathing on the microphone. It wasn't the woman's voice. It was a second voice, a child's voice, small, cold, and perfectly calm, whispering from somewhere inside the dark apartment. "Ask him what happens next time." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The fluorescent lights inside the archive room flickered once, a sharp click echoing through the concrete basement. Then, the monitor of my official dispatch computer terminal turned on by itself, the blue light casting a harsh, pale glow across my face. A new emergency call file popped up on the center of the screen. Origin, unknown/restricted. Location, incorrect sector. Timestamp, tomorrow 2:13 a.m. I stared at the blinking red text while the rain began to hammer softly against the high street-level windows outside. The system didn't make a sound, but the audio routing icon began to flash rhythmically. The phone was ringing. The future was on the line again, waiting for a connection. Slowly, deliberately, I reached my bandaged hand out toward the black headset. Some emergency calls are meant to save lives. Some calls arrive too late to change a thing. And sometimes, the most terrifying calls of all are the ones that haven't even happened yet. If you enjoyed this psychological thriller story, make sure to subscribe to Blackwood Files for more cinematic suspense stories, disturbing mysteries, impossible investigations, and dark late-night thrillers designed specifically for headphone listening. And remember, if a voice from tomorrow ever calls your phone looking for help, think very carefully before you answer.